thank you for joining us today on Beyond the Scale, True Healing. In this fantastic episode, we're talking to the rebel dietitian and author of Dietitian's Dilemma, Michelle Hurn. Thank you so much for taking time to talk with us, Michelle. Just in case there are some people watching who don't know your story, we wondered if you'd give us a brief background about yourself.
You're welcome. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I'll try to give you the Reader's Digest. So, briefly, my health journey began when I was 12. When I was 12 years old, I was diagnosed with anorexia. I was 5 feet tall and about 57 and a half pounds. So, my BMI was 11.7. Just had all kinds of, obviously, problems from starvation. My heart was shutting down, kidneys shutting down. Was given about a 10% chance to survive. Ended up in inpatient treatment for 2 months. And, that process saved my life. But I was basically told, I became weight restored, but I was told I would always suffer with anxiety and stomach issues and racing thoughts around food. Like, I was just told that was going to be my lot in life, So I decided, oh my gosh, I'm just going to have to become this high functioning person with, eating disorder behaviors and eating disorder thoughts. And, I did, I went through high school and into college. I became an athlete and I wanted to become a dietitian because I knew nutrition was powerful. And I feel like I was trying to even heal myself. Like, I thought, is there something I can do to help my anxiety or to help my body? And unfortunately, when I became a dietitian, there are just things that, to become a dietitian, you get your 4-year degree and then you go to an internship. So in my internship, there were things that didn't make sense. Like, for example, we went into the room of somebody with type 2 diabetes. And my dietitian preceptor was saying, okay, so we're going to teach them how to eat, 75 grams of carbohydrates each meal. And I was like, well, wait, isn't their blood sugar high? Oh, yeah. Well, that's why we're going to teach them to eat carbohydrates consistently so we can dose them with medication consistently. And, I remember just asking like, well, maybe they should eat less carbohydrates. And it was like, oh, no, like that was, I was kind of like, oh, this Michelle is this difficult dietetics student. And then we went to the ICU. And I remember flipping over the tube feeding and I was like, oh my God, these are the same ingredients that I was fed as a 12-year-old. So 12 years later, at the age of 24, we're still feeding our patients. And now, 15 years later, the number one ingredients of tube feeding formulas are maltodextrin, canola oil, soy protein, corn syrup. So I simply just asked questions. I just said like, hey, is this really like the best way to feed somebody who's, if you're on tube feeding, you're either been in an accident, you can't take food by mouth, you're going obviously through treatment of anorexia, trying to gain weight. And I was just told like, oh, Michelle, it's about calories. You're asking too many questions. But I was young, as a student, I was like, oh man, okay, maybe I don't get this. And then of course, as a dietitian, it's pounded into you. It doesn't matter what the disease state. Everybody needs carbohydrates. Healthy whole grains are the way. Fruits and vegetables, fiber. And so, I started practicing that way. And it was pretty disheartening because I saw most patients, we called them frequent flyers. They would come in with high blood sugar in a few months. They would, have complications, infections. They would need amputations. But, it wasn't really until I lost my own health in 2019 that I made a really dramatic change to my health, my diet. And that's that's where that kind of led to the whole, dietitian's dilemma. I healed myself by following a very low carbohydrate, incredibly high animal-based protein diet, high fat diet, all saturated fat. And for the first time in my life, my lifelong anxiety went away. My body was hurting. I kind of skipped over that, but my health crisis was I was a marathon runner and I was trying to qualify for the Olympic trials, and just it felt like overnight my body fell apart. I wasn't recovering. I was getting cold sweats. My anxiety went from difficult to paralyzing. And, I asked for help. I reached out to 2 different sports dietitians and they told me I needed more carbohydrates and more sugar. So more carbohydrates than 350 grams. And as you can imagine, that didn't go particularly well. So yeah, it was crisis point, and I just decided I would never run again. And I would just follow this low carb diet because, I was seeing people online that said it was helpful and healing. And even though I was scared, I knew like my health is a disaster. It can't be worse than what I'm going through. And then of course, you have everybody telling you, oh, this is eating disorder. This is only going to set you back. But yeah, within 3 weeks, like I said, my anxiety got so much better. My pain went away. I was able to start not only running again, but now I run ultra marathons. So I run distances longer than 26 miles. I left the hospital setting. I mean, like once you see it, you can't unsee it, and I'm not allowed to teach low carb nutrition or animal-based nutrition in the hospital. So I wrote the book. And it's just been a journey. I've been so blessed. I've gotten to speak at several conferences, low carb conferences. And yeah, recently I just started, I'm working on a grant for a project that I'm starting to help connect people with animal-based foods.
Wow, this is amazing. We would like to ask you some question about eating disorder. So, as you know, I have same background with anorexia, and my mates have as well background about eating disorder, which can be different, like binge eating or stuff like this. And we had a couple of questions about eating disorder, and one of them was, okay, if today you could be changing the way we are dealing with eating disorder in the hospital, what you would do?
I would completely reverse it. I've actually had the privilege to talk to a family who's kind of working on this particular issue. And but basically first of all, how do we treat eating disorders in the hospital setting? So if like somebody came into hospital setting, whether it was binge eating disorder or anorexia, you're immediately going to be put on the standard American diet. So, the first problem with that is if you've been starving yourself and you're underweight, your system is damaged. Your gastrointestinal system is damaged. If you've been binging and purging, your gastrointestinal system is damaged. And so ideally what you need to do is you need to allow that system to heal. Like, we should be providing people with nutrition that is easy to assimilate, is very bioavailable nutrition. Let the GI system heal. But instead, what we immediately do is give them the standard American diet. So flour, sugar, lots of processed foods, lots of fiber, even a damaged system, think about fiber is like a scrub brush. You don't want to put that over a cut, you need to heal. So, that's the first thing we do. And so this person who is either binging or purging or hasn't been eating, we throw all this stuff at their system. So that's already damaged. So they can't really utilize it very well. And it's going to cause, diarrhea, bloating, gas, even more inflammation. And we know that a lot of processed foods can actually have a pretty negative impact on your brain. So your brain is also inflamed when you're, dealing either with starvation or binging or purging. So we need to get that inflammation out of the brain, and we need to provide the brain with a lot of healthy fats. There was a really good clinical trial on anorexia that people who had lost a lot of weight, the gray matter of the brain actually shrank. And then during weight restoration, it actually grew again, which is great. That's good news. That means it can heal. But what if the fat that you're fueling your brain with is all canola oil, is all this super, very, trans fat or harmful fats. So, what I would do is I would immediately put people, on a very low carbohydrate animal-based diet, because once again, there's this dogma that you can't restrict people who have a dysfunctional relationship with food. And I understand the thinking behind that, right? Oh, these people, they're not eating, or they're clearly we can't tell them not to eat these things. But you have to look at the impact of what those foods do on your brain and body, because it's if we're going to eat something and it's going to harm our brain and body, why in the world would we do that? So what I would do is I would do a very, high fat, high animal protein diet, because just doing that too also will stabilize blood sugar. And we know just doing that alone actually helps reduce anxiety. But then you're also giving the body and, your GI and your brain a chance to heal, and we know the brain also needs a lot of certain vitamins and minerals to make neurotransmitters. And those are very bioavailable in animal products. And a lot of people with eating disorders are not eating beef and, tallow and butter and fat. So those things will help nourish our brain, nourish our body. And then, then I would address, obviously, if you have any type of eating disorder, you tend to have, trauma, something else that's going on. But I feel like we make a huge mistake by really trying to address that trauma. You go into treatment and we're doing therapy, we're doing all this stuff, but we're feeding you in a way with the standard American diet that you're not actually able to utilize and absorb that information very well, because you just still have so much inflammation in your gut and in your brain. So I want to help heal your gut and brain, help calm that down. And then we can start to address some of those other aspects.
Yeah, I can relate to this because when they were feeding me with the standard American diet, I was feeling really bad due to the food I was eating. And so I was scared of the food, and eating the food I was feeling worse than when I was starving. So this was just
Yes.
crazy. And as
Yes. And that's such a tragedy. I apologize for cutting you off. I genuinely feel like most people, at least initially, you know, and there's people that will say like, no, I don't want to get better. But a lot of people with eating disorders want to get better. And if we can feed you in a way, like if we're feeding you the standard American diet and it's causing so much discomfort and pain, is it any wonder? Statistically, 50% of people, when they leave treatment, are going to immediately lose weight, like immediately stop eating. And, you know, and people, I remember I talked to a doctor that was like, oh, patients with eating disorders are just manipulative. And I'm like, maybe they just don't want to hurt. Maybe our stomachs hurt and we just want to eat in a way, because when you don't eat, you don't have that crazy GI pain, you know, and also, so that really gets me going. So I'm sorry you had to deal with that. I certainly had to deal with that too. But it's like, what if we fed people to where it's like, oh, my body doesn't hurt anymore. I actually feel better, you know?
yeah, it's exactly what's happened to me when I started eating fat. When I went to eat butter and meat, and I was just feeling so good and I could refeed myself, but I was not able to refeed while eating standard American diet, of course. Currently in the low carb community, there is a lot going on about tracking macros, tracking everything. What do you think about people with a past of eating disorder, tracking their food, measuring, weighting, stuff like this?
Yeah, you know, I can see for me, and this is just my experience and as a clinician and someone who's had an eating disorders, I think it can be a very slippery slope. You know, there are certain conditions where you really need to be in ketosis. Like, let's say you have severe epilepsy, like you really need to be in ketosis. Or I actually worked with somebody in the hospital once that had a glioblastoma, so they were using a ketogenic diet as like a therapy for their brain tumor. So in that case, yes, you have to track very, very carefully. You have to breathe. You know, we want to make sure you're blowing out acetone, you're getting ketones. But for most people, I think tracking can actually kind of mess with your head, to be honest with you. But another, on the flip side, you know, women specifically tend to overeat, or I'm sorry, not overeat, undereat. You know, so it comes down to I want people to just be able to eat. And I mean, how food is supposed to be. You're supposed to be able to eat and like move on with your life, you know? And it can be hard. I remember even when I first started a carnivore diet, you know, I was not underweight, but I remember eating like a lot. It was kind of scary. It was like my body just needed all this butter and all this meat. And I remember there was one meal I ate over 2 pounds of beef and a stick of butter. And I'm like, all right, I guess that's what we're doing. You know, so I feel like if people are tracking, you know, you might underdo it. You might kind of freak yourself out. Like, I can't believe I'm eating this many calories or this much fat. So I would love for people to just move away from that. And even, you know, especially initially, just err on the side of, I'm going to eat, you know, once again, until I'm satiated, till I'm full. Because, you know, your body, so many of us have underate meat and fat for so many years. It might take your body a minute. You know, it took my body, a few months to really kind of level out. And then there'll be a point where it's, I probably don't eat as much, now as I did initially in that first period. But yeah, I'm honestly not a huge fan of tracking, and I've had people tell me like, oh, I feel like if I don't track, I undereat. And, I can't speak to that. I think if you have to just be very careful and just be very honest with yourself. Like, why are you tracking? Like, if it's like, okay, I'm way underweight and I need to hit 5,000 calories, so I'm going to track. It's like, okay, then I understand that. But if it's, most of us spent so many times. With all the time I spent as a young human tracking food, counting calories meticulously, I could do a lot of stuff with that time. So I prefer people to, just really eat to satiation, get back to what food was supposed to be, something enjoyable, something to fuel you, not something to freak out and obsess over.
Yeah. Another question related to this: what are your thoughts about fasting when people have a past of eating disorder?
Yeah, fasting, and I've never actually spoke to Jason Fung, and I read his book, and I think he has some really good,
I read this book
research.
as well.
Yeah, okay, so it's very smart and it's very scientifically sound. But I also think, if you are part of like a low carb, ketogenic, or carnivore, community, you really have to think about when I think about nutrition, I think about everything in context, right? Like how I eat, as someone, even with a history of an eating disorder, is going to be different than maybe if I have a client who's very overweight and type 2 diabetic and has never had an eating disorder, right? So I think for somebody with a history of an eating disorder, fasting can be a very slippery slope, meaning that, if you're restricting, it's kind of, I would just much rather see people get in a consistent rhythm. Because I think, we've spent so much, or I know I spent a lot of my life like restricting food and, kind of doing these different time windows or trying to go as long as I could without eating. For the small benefits you might get of fasting, being like, it can kind of help with cellular turnover and some things, I think the potential to kind of set you back is greater. So I don't recommend fasting for anybody that's had a history of an eating disorder. I would much rather people eat, 3 times a day, eat the low carb, eat fat, whether you're low carb or, ketogenic or carnivore, whatever. And I just think that's just a better way to set yourself up for long-term success.
I totally agree. And as I said, being anorexic, I was able to fast for ages, and if tomorrow I can fast, I'm sure I can. I can roll a 42, 72. I don't know how many hours. I was almost able to fast for 6 months, so it's okay.
Exactly. I think most of us have already served our time fasting.
Yeah. So I don't want to be hungry anymore, so there is no point to starve myself. But anyway.
I hear that. Exactly.
So I think we went through the question we wanted to ask you about eating disorder, and now we have a couple of questions about you being an athlete. Okay. Yeah. First of all, are you not scared about over-exercising?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm not. I think, so much of like life is context, right? If somebody asked me, would you recommend what you do for most people? I would say absolutely not. Most people, and once again, for reference, I'm an ultra marathon runner, meaning that I compete in distances over 26 miles. I think, where my mind is and where my health is, though, is very important. I spent my early years as an athlete very underweight. I even look back at a picture of myself from 2019, before I was a low carb athlete. I was a much higher carb athlete, but I look at it, I'm like, oh man, I look rough. You can see my clavicle sticking out, like I'm just underweight. And so, I'm very fortunate that I work with a coach for my running. And, I've been successful. I've been able to not only, run well, but also continue to fuel my body really well. And I think, it's just something that I enjoy and it's a passion of mine. I think you really, whatever you do, especially as far as exercising, I think you have to dig deep and decide like, what is my motivation? Like, I never get up running thinking like, man, if I don't run, I'm not going to eat, or man, I don't calculate how many miles I run and and be like, well, I ran that much, and so now I get to eat this much. Those are very eating disorder behaviors that I used to do, obviously, as a young person. But yeah, I don't overthink it or worry about it. And people have asked me about it, and I'm just going to continue to do it as long as I enjoy it, as long as it makes me happy and it's something that I can chase. Distance running has been a passion of mine since I was a much younger person. So yeah, for me, it's a good thing. But obviously, if somebody was doing it, once again, you gotta be honest with yourself and check your motivation. If you're doing it to lose weight, if you're doing it to burn calories, whatever that is. And I'm also pretty cognizant of health parameters. Like, I always make sure I'm menstruating, I'm having a period. I don't really check my weight very often, but I do probably like once every couple months, just to make sure that I don't want to be losing weight, so yeah. But once again, that's just for me. I mean, most people probably should not be, or probably, just wouldn't even want to do the crazy long running that I do.
Yeah. And yeah, for most of people with a past of eating disorder, exercising is to compensate the food they have eaten or the one they are going to eat. So when it's on this behalf, it's not good.
Yes. And another thing is like, I take days off, that's something I never used to do. There's days that I don't run. And of course on those days, I don't really change how I eat. I used to, when I was struggling with my eating disorder, if I didn't walk or lift or do an X amount of exercise, I would punish yourself and not be able to eat. But I love my off days. Those are days that I'm actually able to take in, more calories because I'm not running, you get a few hours back. So I think it really, any type of exercise as someone with a history of an eating disorder really has to be very cognizant, have a good mindset. And that also is why, I've been running a long time, but I always have a coach. I always want to make sure I have somebody to keep me accountable, to check in. So yeah, I mean, any type of exercise you do, I think you need to approach with caution, and you need to be weight stable for sure.
Yeah. And another question regarding the exercise, a lot of people in the low carb community are advertising for the weightlifting, the resistance training, and no cardio at all. What do you reply?
Yeah. Well, we know, and I'm a big fan of Dr. Gabriel Lyon, is that weightlifting and resistance training, excuse me, in general is important. We know, that's going to help build bone. That's going to help with healthy muscles. And as far as cardio goes, I don't know. I don't see any problem with enjoying, getting your heart rate up. I think that can be a really, even just from like an anxiety reducing thing. I think doing something, whether that's going for a jog or even just, a faster walk, I don't necessarily see that being a bad thing. There certainly is some research that when you do that, and as much as like I do, when you're running for hours, it can long-term be a really potentially not great thing for your heart or for your body. But like, once again, it's your goal. Like if you asked me, you said, Michelle, you're going to live either to 75 or 85. If you stop running right now, you'll live to 85. But if you keep doing all the running, you're only going to live to 75. And I feel like, it'll be a better year for me because it's something I love, and it's something I'm chasing after. But just to answer your question, I think, I mean, ideally, if you're literally just like, I just want to do this for health, to me, it makes the most sense to do both. It makes the most sense to, do a little bit of resistance training where you're stressing your muscles, and also do some of that cardio where you're getting your heart rate up.
Yeah. With the exercise, do you care about the amount of protein you're eating in a day? Like,
I mean,
to eat not less than something, or?
Yeah, I would say, most of the time I don't really flex up or down too much, like on a daily basis. My training kind of goes in cycles, to where certainly as I get closer to my race, my training will be higher. So I'll make sure I'm just eating a bit more. But for me, I shouldn't say never, but most of the time, 95% of the time, I'm not going under, 1 gram of protein per body weight. Our recommended dietary allowance is something goofy like 0.8 per kilogram. So for someone my weight, it would be, I want to say like 50 grams of protein a day, which that won't work. I'm looking at like 125, between 135 minimum. And I'm never afraid to go over. I would always, there are days that, like I said, I'm just really hungry, and I'm very fortunate that we have access to, beef, we have some fish, we have plenty of protein. So I would much rather see people lean on the side of getting a little bit more protein versus, not getting enough.
Yeah, I'm the same. And
we were able to cover a lot in today's meeting with our guest, Michelle. Michelle, thank you so much for spending this time with us and sharing your knowledge and your experiences with us. We will have all of Michelle's information linked below, so you can buy her book, The Dietitian's Dilemma. You can also work directly with her on your health goals and find her on social media with those links. Please take a minute to like, share, comment, click subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. And don't forget, you can join us live or for live meetings and other special guests when you subscribe to Heart Carnivore on the Mighty Networks for just $10 a month. The link to join, along with the links for all of the ways that you can connect with us, are also listed below. Thanks. Bye.